So as Henry says, I'm going to talk about how to generate a symphony today, or to link ourselves more to the conference main theme, the human side of automatic composition. And that human side is going to be a strong emphasis of what I talk about here. I'd like to start by thanking Matthias Röder and the Karajan Institute for the invitation to come and speak today, and for making this really exciting and interesting conference happen after all, despite the odds. And I'd also like to thank Deutsche Telekom, who initiated the project that I'm going to talk about and are funding it. Along with this team, these people and several more people who are involved in the project. It's by no means me on my own, lots of people involved. Too many to thank by name and in detail, so I've made a tiny URL here that you can follow to find out all about it. There's also some blogs that I've written on there about this project, so it's set out in prose. The project is to attempt, this is why it's called Beethoven X, to realize some form of the 10th Symphony, the infamous 10th Symphony, for which we have just a little bit of fragmentary evidence of what Beethoven's plans for this piece might have been, but frankly, very little to go on for a completion in a scholarly sense, to get an hour's worth of symphony, perhaps 70 musicians, all of that kind of stuff happening from what survives. And so the project is to see whether we can do something with that using the awesome power of AI. And along the way, to think about what kinds of projects, what kinds of creative processes we would like to see using AI, what kinds of roles we want humans to have in there, what kinds of formats we can have that interaction looking like. So that's going to be what I talk about today. Basically, how do we get from this? This is a sketch page Beethoven wrote, very strongly attributed to Beethoven, also very strongly linked to plans for the 10th Symphony, although that text on the top of the page there saying 10th Symphony is by someone else. And also even more cryptically from this is Beethoven again, but sketching now not in musical notation, but in words, to this, a full symphony orchestra performance. This, of course, is Karajan, the namesake of the Institute and of our conference. So how do we produce something of that scale from these very sort of modest and small fragmentary origins? More to the point, how can we do it in terms of the practicalities involved, data, processes, all that kind of stuff? How should we do it? What constitutes a suitable style? This is not a free composition project as such. It's an attempt to create something that Beethoven himself may have written, or that may have been written in 1827 in a symphonic format with particular kinds of trappings for what that might look like. So very particular constraints here. And how might we want to go about doing this? So what kinds of human-computer collaboration, interaction, back and forth could we imagine now, and might we envisage for our future? For projects of this kind and for free composition projects. So I'm going to divide the task at hand as I see it into three broad parts. The first is starting points, so what we have to go on, what we can start using. The second is taking those starting points and setting specific AI tasks to accomplish. So the idea here is that we don't simply press a button and get a symphony out of the other side. But we break it down into smaller projects where we can ask the AI to do something specific for us, not write symphony, but something more detailed. The third part, review and selecting the materials that are generated, perhaps going back to the drawing board, stitching it all together, that kind of stuff. I'm going to leave for today. The next talk in this session features Walter Vetzova, who is our lead on that side of the project. So I'll let him talk about that side, and I'll just focus on those first two. So by way of starting points, we have these fragments of music, but there's a lot more to be done with that. We have to make lots of decisions about how we read those sketches. And furthermore, as I say, if we're going to come up with an overall plan that we want to realize, then on what basis do we do that? That can certainly be data-driven, but there's a strong human hand that can be had in there, and I will argue should be present in that process. So I'm going to talk through some details about that, first of all. Starting points then, and beginning, as I say, with musical sketches. So let's go back to that page that we saw before. This really looks like a scherzo theme with a trio theme about halfway down the page that's ostensibly linked to it. So really wonderful. We've got a melody here, pretty clear by Beethoven's standards what's going on, what it's intended for. Really good stuff to go with. But as you can probably tell, whether you read music or not, and I should say that's not an important part of the talk, so just you can follow along, there's still lots of work to be done here. If you've ever written down a handwritten note and someone else has struggled to read it, well, you're in good company. Beethoven is absolutely the same. He writes like this, and more clearly in some cases, less clearly in other cases, and it's a real job to try and work out what's on the page there. More complicated still, Beethoven, of course, will sketch an initial idea for a piece, which would be quite different, perhaps, from the final form of that theme as it manifests in the work itself. And so we might have a kind of simpler version that gets transformed into a more detailed version or gets changed in various ways. So there are lots and lots of open questions here. But for us to get any kind of traction on this computationally, we need to get from this kind of format into some kind of what you might think of as a cleaned up format like this, where we're encoded. And you heard a lot about this in Cynthia's talk. We have these different sources, and the links between them are super important. In doing this, we haven't used any computational methods at all, really. There is technology for getting from a PDF score image onto an encoded format like this, and it's getting better all the time, and it's really exciting. But it's enough of a task for that to work just from printed musical notation, which you can rely on looking the same all over the place. And it's seriously beyond the scope to expect it to do anything with that Beethoven sketch. So currently, at least, this is really a human task. And I should say that there are really exciting projects like the Beethoven Werkstatt, which are beginning to annotate the sketch pages in a way that we might be able to get some computational traction on. But currently, this is a human task. And so when I transcribe that in this way, I'm making many deductions. And it's not only a question of exactly what pixel by pixel it looks like on that original page, but making deductions about what else Beethoven was doing at this time, his kind of interest, what he might have had in mind for ambiguous moments. And so there are a couple of notes which are perhaps, slightly different from the most literal transcription of that page. That's based on, for instance, as I say, looking at other pieces. So again, don't worry if you don't follow the musical notation. What this is trying to show is that there's a particular kind of interval, a particular leap that gets tessellated 3 times in my reading of this theme. And people will disagree about their reading of this theme, as I say. And that's compelling to me, partly because it's kind of a neat structure, but it seems to be compelling to Beethoven also. He was interested, it seems, in writing themes like that. So this is partly by analogy, as I say, to other late period works, so of the same time, where he's doing something similar. This is a fugue theme from the Opus 110 piano sonata. Da, 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 da. That's the theme there. And there are many other pieces that seem to have this same kind of thematic shape. So we have our scherzo possible theme in the top left here. There's arguably an inverted form of that in the 9th Symphony in the 3rd movement. This is the Opus 110 sonata I just mentioned a second ago, and that fugue theme is reprised in inversion later on. Finally, the famous, wonderful cryptic Es muss sein theme, also arguably a close relative of that. So it's contextual evidence that a computational method can get some traction on, although it's not necessarily the most ready form of doing that. So we heard from Cynthia, for instance, about tasks that are best performed by humans and others better performed by machines, computers. It also has the benefit, possibly, of linking to the trio theme. So this same interval that's leaped here is now being outlined in the trio theme, making those 2 complementary parts of that same movement more thematically connected. Very human deductions going on here in preparation for the computational work that will follow. So much for musical starting points. As I say, even more cryptic are the textual sketches where Beethoven writes by hand ideas that he might have had for this piece, or more properly speaking, either this piece or the 9th Symphony, or possibly some other piece, or possibly never to be realized at all. We can't really know. There's lots and lots of deduction and interpretation, and frankly, guesswork that has to go in here. But that's not to say, despite those caveats, that there isn't some really interesting and compelling content here for us to work with, again, in preparation for doing those computational tasks. So the wonderful people at the Beethoven House Bonn have transcribed this into what that text says, the experts in Beethoven's handwriting. And some things pop out for my attention, at least, like mention of Musik in den alten Tonarten. Music in the old modes. That's to say music that's alluding in some way, some technical way, to the time before major and minor were super ubiquitous and common in classical music. And this is really compelling, at least I think, partly because, again, Beethoven was doing this in the late stages of his life. So here's another string quartet movement, which we don't need to even rely on our musical reading of the score for this, is explicitly labeled as being in the Lydian mode, in one of these older church modes. So the fact that, the idea at least, that Beethoven might have been thinking in this way in preparation for the 10th symphony is a really interesting one and very consistent with other pieces of the time. Even more interesting, perhaps, and related to this also perhaps, there's mention specifically of Herrgott dich loben wir in text, but clearly alluding to some kind of musical source. Now, we don't know what musical source Beethoven might have had in mind here, but we have a pretty good idea, because there are forms of this theme in many Bach movements, in many hymnals that were circulated at the time. There's lots of contextual evidence to be had from the context to what that might look like. And it might look a little something like this. This, again, a transcription, a kind of reading of all of those possibilities into some kind of format. And again, there's a possibility for connecting up all the dots and having everything in a central repository where we can draw on this stuff in a contextual way, but we're not there currently. And it's a lot of sort of human deduction that goes into this decision-making process. But now, from reading that text, we've got another musical starting point that we can really begin to generate on, to do something computational with, that we didn't initially have to start with. This also speaks to a wider, even more nebulous sense of some kind of retrospective spirit in the piece that scholars like Barry Cooper have mentioned. So for instance, the slow movement theme, the sketches up the top here, is a very, very clear nod to an earlier piano sonata movement, the slow movement of the Pathétique sonata. What might Beethoven have had in mind there? Does it make the 10th very different in tone from the 9th? What are we supposed to do with that? And again, what could we do with that computationally once we've made those kinds of decisions as humans? Okay, this all leads nicely on to other kinds of starting points. So to the corpus, the contents of the corpora that we would be training on, if we want to generate music of a particular kind, Beethovenian music, or music of a particular style, we need to be training on music that's somehow related to that. And that might seem relatively straightforward, and in some simple cases it is, but there are still a lot of questions to be answered, again, that we can get some kind of computational traction on, but which really invite a human hand, I will argue. So let's take the example of fugues. This is a particular process that composers would often use, and there is evidence that Beethoven was thinking of writing at least one fugue into this work. So it's not merely hypothetical, this is a real possibility for the 10th. So we might want to start with all of the movements by Beethoven himself that are explicitly titled fugue and that have a whole movement's worth of fugue. And this is perhaps a sort of initial list of them, pretty comprehensive. We could discuss the inclusions or otherwise, but we've explicitly excluded movements for which there's a section that's fugal. Should we have them involved? And in any case, there's problems like, we're writing an orchestral piece here, but the stuff that we're training on in this case is not orchestral. So is that too different to be useful, or should we somehow synthesize it with more orchestral music? While we're at it, we might wonder whether we should include some fugues by other composers, and arguably, very strongly arguably, yes, we should. Beethoven would have known other fugues, and so he would have had them in his mind while he was thinking about this piece. So probably Mozart. How about Mozart? How about Haydn? Should we keep going further back? Should we go back to Bach? Should we limit ourselves to fugues that we know Beethoven knew? And how strongly attested is that link? Should we limit ourselves perhaps to fugues that would have been known to composers who wrote the fugues that we are training on? You see where I'm getting at here? Where does one draw the line for inclusion or exclusion from that training set? And really interestingly, again, if we're going back to this Musik in den alten Tonarten, we might arguably go back to Renaissance music, so much earlier musics, which you could argue as being kind of proto-fugal in some ways. Maybe some of those movements and not others. Lots and lots of decisions to be made here before we even begin anything, really. To take a different example, there's a very strong agreement behind the idea that Sonata movements have particular kinds of prototypes. So if you have a 4-movement sonata, there's a particularly sort of prototypical first movement type, second movement type, third movement type, fourth movement type. Again, lots to discuss here, but it's a strongly attested idea, so it's worth thinking about. And if we want to create some kind of prototypical first movement type, then we could train on those movements. But what should we include? And again, that question is not so straightforwardly answered. So for instance, for the first piano sonata of Beethoven, there does seem to be a good matchup. So the first numbered movement, second, third, and fourth, match up with the first, second, third, and fourth prototypes, arguably. So we could arguably be strongly committed to putting those movements in that order. But this doesn't map out to the rest of the piano sonatas, nor to the symphonies, nor to many other contexts. So for instance, in the very famous Moonlight Sonata, one could make a case for saying that the first numbered movement, that is the opening, is more akin to the second movement prototype, not least for the very simple fact that it's very slow. So should that be a part of the training corpus for slow movement second movements, or should it be included in first movements? Or should we let some kind of data-driven method decide on classification before we begin populating corpora with these different works? And likewise for the Opus 109 Sonata, even more complicatedly, you could say perhaps first movement prototype, third movement prototype, second movement prototype. But it's very, very complicated when you get to the late works. And that, of course, is what we're dealing with. We're trying to create a late Beethoven work where, in that context, Beethoven will very happily, routinely meld different prototypes together, deliberately play with those ideas of what you might expect to see in these movement types. So a lot of complicated questions. Perhaps we're looking for some kind of hybrid in there. We could also think about the length and the structure of the piece that we're trying to create. So we don't just start generating a measure 1 and get through to the end of the piece and it's done when it's done. We come up with a plan in advance. Again, this could be a data-driven plan based on the kinds of proportions and the kinds of sections that we've seen in previous works. And again, there's some ways of getting computational handles on that, but there's also a great value to human annotation of what those movements are doing, what the structure is. So here, for instance, is a data-driven read on the third movement, fourth movement, fifth movement. Just how long are they in terms of measures and in terms of some symbolic value like the quarter note. We could use just how long they are in minutes and seconds, but performances vary so widely in their length that maybe that's not the most useful starting point. Likewise, we could look at structural groupings. And here's a tree diagram representing a movement where there's an assertion that there's a large structural section called an exposition, which itself breaks down into these levels, and from there breaks down into those levels, and these sections are of those lengths, so 4 measures, and so on going through. But this has been produced by humans. And of course, there's a trade-off there between, if we're going to use human annotation and rely on that being of good quality, there's a trade-off between quality and quantity, because there's only so many people we can get involved. And again, that's why efforts like the Tromper Project, which we heard about before, are so great for trying to bring people together to collaborate on these matters, so we can get a sense of what people think is going on. We could even look at where the theme goes. So what theme is happening at any one time? Where does the theme change? And what instrument is it in from one moment to the next? Okay, so let's assume we've done all of that and we've made all those human decisions. Now we're on to the business of generating material to try and fit these moments, these molds, these sections. And here we can ask for very specific things from the AI. So maybe we have a fragmentary melody that we want to extend into a full melody, or a full melody that we want to add accompanimental parts to. And now we've got those accompanimental parts. We've got what you could call a short score that we want to orchestrate. In all cases, we want to have part-whole pairs. So we want to have the small thing and the larger thing as a matched training corpus that we can get to understand the relationship between the two, so we can generate new versions of that. And it might look something like this: extend your melody, add accompanimental parts, orchestrate it out. That's the kind of general sense of what we're looking for here. But again, there are problems. Where is the theme? You know, where is the melody? Even in chamber music, you might assume that it's in the top part, so the first violin of a string quartet, or in the voice if you have one in other kinds of chamber musics. but it's not always the case. It moves around. And in symphonies, of course, it moves around a lot. So here again, there's something to be said for human annotations. And my colleague Nikolai Bollefeld, who's on this call, I think, has gone through them and annotated the movements so we can have some kind of interaction with that. So he's gone through and annotated this to say that in this very famous case of the first movement of Beethoven 5, we have this theme A, this motif A, if you like, which is recurring all over the place. And then I've written some code that extracts his annotations and puts it into a single melody line score. So we have a representation of this piece where it's just the melody, even though it's moving around between instruments all over the place. So a different kind of score that no one is going to perform from, but is useful to have as part of our training corpus. And again, involving a lot of human intervention. To take the last case then, when we want to go from a short score to a fully orchestral score, here we can leverage a bit more fully automated computational approaches. Getting from something like this, which might be similar to what we generate, this of course is not generated, this is Beethoven's First Symphony, into this full orchestral score with flutes, oboes, clarinets, the works. So this is no particular parts, and this is very particular parts where everyone knows what they're supposed to play. We could reverse engineer this problem to get a sense of which parts are being doubled at the same time. So again, don't worry if you don't follow the notation, but you can see this is the same kind of idea, right, in those two parts. And likewise, these two are doing something similar, here too, and here again. So with computational methods, we can find those moments and reduce it from this orchestral version into this short score, such that we have this sense to which we can train on matching between those short scores to those orchestral scores, so that we're ready for generated material that can likewise be converted into an orchestral version. So that you might think of in this kind of sense. We have a strong sense of what the short score orchestral score pair looks like. And as long as we've made our short score similar enough to our new generation, then we should be able to get out to our orchestral version. But again, even in writing that code, I have to make a lot of decisions about how much to pare it down and in what kinds of ways. What are the important bits and what are the less important bits? Lots of human decisions going into that. So that's all I have time to talk about today. I'm happy to expand on any of these parts. And like I say, there are these blogs which set out a bit more of this. And of course, I'll be in the Slack after this caller. I just wanted to leave you with a few parting thoughts on this. Basically, lots of roles for humans in this kind of task. And I would invite everyone who's in this area and everyone in the wider world to think about what kind of interaction we want to have. So we currently don't have unlimited data and great vistas of infrastructure possibilities, but we will soon have more. And so we can start to ask whether this is a useful model for how we want to interact with computers, or do we want to do something different? And is it specific to the fact that we're here doing effectively a pastiche composition, trying to create something in the style of Beethoven, or is it different for free composition? What are our answers to that? What is the kind of enduring model that we want to see for these kinds of tasks so that composers can harness AI for particular kinds of tasks to create the music that they want to create, a music of our age? Thank you very much.
Peter Revers has a question.
Yeah, so Peter is asking about the place of innovation. You know, if we're trying to train on a statistically normative set of works, you know, what is the most likely thing to have come out of this? How do we capture that wonderfully radical spirit that Beethoven adopted, you know, to do the unexpected? And this is a great question. This is a great, you know, I think that we're really at the beginning of doing anything with automatic composition to get anything even credible, sounding roughly like a Beethoven 10. Let alone getting into these nitty gritty. But I think it speaks to some of the stuff that we've been talking about here, thinking about exactly what you train on, which decisions that you make in advance. We took a view that we were going to not train on anything after 1827 in order that we only have the pieces that Beethoven at least might have known. But there's something to be said for including some later musics to get a sense of where we're going. If we had a really rich data set where we, you know, had every movement and every type and full annotations, we could perhaps get some kind of sense of a trajectory. But of course, art doesn't work that way. You know, there isn't just this unilinear progress where everything follows on from the thing that went before. So it's a really good question, and I don't have any quick answers at the moment, but these are the kinds of things that we need to keep coming back to as the techniques for this develop.
Thank you.